An ethical doctor is the only protection a vulnerable person has from a dehumanizing, one-size-fits-all public health system and from the powerful or vested interests of Big Pharma. Yet, the few courageous ethical doctors who dared to voice vaccine safety concerns during the pandemic were persecuted and censored by the authorities, media, and regulators. It is very serious for patient safety when doctors can't advocate for their patients and become mere agents for the state. Now, that is a quote from Dr. Elizabeth Evans of the UK Medical Free Alliance, who made a presentation at the People's Vaccine Inquiry. Now, as a consequence of reading that, it confirmed my desire to undertake this and perhaps a number of other presentations, because I'm a doctor of chiropractic, and the term doctor originally meant educator, informer of information. And one of the situations that is perhaps relatively unique for my position is that I am not lumbered by the protocols or the fear of retribution by being in the NHS, and therefore, unlike some of the doctors who tried to speak out during the pandemic, who either didn't for fear of being ostracized and cancelled, or actually who did and did get cancelled, I feel that I have a duty of care to inform the public, and also a requirement so to do. And in the last 5 years since COVID, I have done a lot of research, and I'm going to do a series of little videos, I hope, which will give some information. This one and perhaps a few more maybe on COVID, but it's about trying to pull together the information I've come across in the last few years. Because a number of people would ask why Sweden was the outlier in regards to what happened with COVID. In actual fact, when you look at the WHO pandemic protocols prior to 2020, what Sweden did was just exactly what they should have done. They, and they alone, adopted the protocols. They didn't lock down because it had been agreed before that it was wrong to lock down. They didn't vaccinate early because the protocol prior to 2020 had said it was a problem. And the reason it was a problem to vaccinate during a pandemic, there are a number of reasons. But one, it is known that a vaccination will suppress your immune system for around about 2 weeks after you've had the vaccine. Now, in a pandemic, by definition, the virus is firing around all over the place, so you have a greater likelihood of catching it, particularly if you're an elderly person, and supposedly and understandably in the vulnerable group. The one time you don't want to have your immune system suppressed is when the virus is rampant. And this is a statement of fact which has been known for a long time, and also what was known, and this is why it was misinformed. It was said after the vaccine rollout that the vast majority of people in hospital with COVID were the unvaccinated. Now, this was actually untrue, and it was a falsifying of the evidence, because it was deemed, because of the known suppression that happens for 2 weeks after one is vaccinated, it was deemed to be better to lie to the public effectively, so that all those who were vaccinated were not registered as vaccinated for at least 2 weeks after they had been vaccinated. Ironically, a large proportion of those people in hospital with COVID had been vaccinated, and you can understand why. Because their immune system was suppressed. The virus was rampant because it was deemed to be a pandemic. It was all about the place. So an immune system suppressed means you're more likely to catch something. You catch what's going on. You're an elderly person. You're in hospital because you're unwell. So it was just the wrong thing to do, and it was a huge amount of misinformation about that. Other things that one wasn't told, for instance, in Pfizer's randomized clinical trial, which is obviously a double-blinded trial, which means that both halves of the trial, those who had the placebo and those who had the vaccine, it should be a long-standing trial going on for a minimum of 3 years. Actually, after 3 months, the blindedness of the trial was opened up and everyone knew whether they'd had the vaccine or not had the vaccine. And because of the fear that was going around the world, those who hadn't had the vaccine in the placebo element of the trial jumped on board quite naturally and took the vaccine. So therefore we didn't have and couldn't have and still don't have really any long-term studies telling us what the long-term effects of COVID are. Additionally, amazingly, out of 140,000 people who were in the Pfizer trial, and this evidence comes from a gentleman called Dr. Carl Hennigan, who's based in Oxford and a very reputable gentleman. He stated that only, I'm not sure if it was 12 or 14 people of 140,000 people that were chosen. And the word is chosen because what you may not know is when drug companies do these trials, they don't just take the first 140,000 people that come off the street. They particularly select them based on what they wish the outcome of the trial to be. So there were only 14 people over the age of 64 who were party to Pfizer's trial. Amazing when you think about it, when this was known to be a virus which mostly affected the elderly. I can't remember the exact figure, but similarly, there were a phenomenally small number of pregnant ladies who were part of any trial. And none of those who were pregnant in the trial were in the first trimester. Well, we all know because that's pretty much when everything develops. It's after the first trimester. All that happens is the baby gets bigger and fatter, basically, but everything predominantly is set in stone within that first trimester. So it's the most critical one. But no one in the trial for the COVID jab was pregnant in the first trimester. So how on earth was it correct to advocate to pregnant mothers that they should be vaccinated? Additionally, no children were in the trial, and it was known that there was no issue with the children at all. So when you add to the fact that, of course, Pfizer wanted to keep secret their outcomes for 75 years, and it was only when a judge in the States overruled that the papers were released. So there were lots of issues of concern when you understand the situation. Further, it was known the benefit of vitamin D. There was a study that was done in Cordoba in Spain, small study, but it was a relevant study, where I think it was, something like 50, I think there were 50 people who were already in hospital, elderly people in hospital, and they wanted to see whether if they gave them a huge shot of vitamin D, that would stop them going into intensive care. I think they gave 50 people a huge dose of vitamin D, and they gave 28 people no vitamin D. None of the 50 who were given the high dosage of vitamin D ended up in intensive care. And the figure is in the order of 19 of the 24 who weren't, the elderly people who weren't given vitamin D, ended up in ICU. And a large proportion of those, my memory seems to think 12 of those died. So although it was a small study, the information, the signal there was massive. But of course, vitamin D is very cheap, and no one really makes any money out of giving you vitamin D. Now, I quoted from the People's Vaccine Inquiry, which I understand is a different inquiry, which is nothing to do with the ongoing government inquiry, which has spent millions and millions and gone on for a considerable period of time, because those who know realize that the government inquiry is not asking the correct questions. I think it was module 4, which was meant to be the one, which was really looking at and questioning the vaccine. But the main King's Counsel, gentleman called Hugh, whose name I forget, but he deflected all issues in relation to questioning the efficacy and the appropriateness of the vaccine. So, as we know in many, many inquiries, it's only done for a face. So this People's Vaccine Inquiry has taken evidence from many, many clinicians, and is worth looking at. As I say, the People's Vaccine Inquiry. The other thing that you may or may not have come across, which is called the Great Barrington Declaration. Now, the Great Barrington Declaration was put together by someone called Dr. Bhattacharya, who, with a colleague, basically realizing that things weren't going as they should do, very early on in the pandemic, wrote a direction as to what should happen. And they basically said that the elderly people were the only people that needed to be protected and isolated, and everyone else should go about their daily business, ostensibly. Now, and I say, the gentleman who wrote it was called Dr. J. Bhattacharya, and J. Bhattacharya and another author whose name I show disrespect for not remembering, they had over 20,000 signatures within a very short period of time from doctors who understood pandemics, understood viruses, understood how you should deal with this situation. And of course, unfortunately, because of what happened with the media and how they were captured, and what happened with Twitter at the time and how that was captured, and what happened with Facebook, all these eminent professors and people who had the right knowledge were, to use the current parlance, cancelled. And unfortunately, that is why so many things that were unpleasant arose. And a lot of people, you'll have heard Matt Hancock and others saying, spouting that the jab, the vaccine, saved millions of lives. Well, that commentary only came about not from fact and data, but that was how the modelling, and if you remember, the modelling was done from Imperial College by a gentleman who was then discredited because he couldn't keep things in place and broke the lockdown rules, let's say. But yes, all the arguments that the vaccine save lives is only based on the modelling. There is, from what I understand, there is no actual data, concrete data to substantiate that the vaccine saved lives. There does seem to be a lot of data to say that it caused a lot of harm. There was a gentleman called Dr. Roger Watson, who's a colorectal surgeon, who has just done a presentation that I listened to, which basically said the incidence of colorectal cancer has skyrocketed since 2021. Things that he's never seen before, or only very rarely seen before, are happening much more often. People of a certain age who've never had any form of colorectal cancer have lots of clots were happening in the gut and in the lungs and other places, obviously because the spike protein got into the heart as well as other places, because some of you may not know that traditional vaccines, they stay where they're put. In other words, where they're injected, they stay there, and everything, the immune system goes past it, for want of a better term, and then the immune system gets enacted, and off you go. But with the mRNA vaccine, the messenger mRNA vaccine, this, because it's the mRNA, is called messenger RNA, and its job is to take messages to create DNA, which obviously is what makes all our cells. It was transported by what we call nano lipoparticles, so very, 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 very small pieces of fat, as basically little vehicles which will take them around the body. And because they were fat, that allowed them to go through across the cell membrane, and therefore the vaccine didn't stay where it was jabbed. It went around the body, and it has been found in the ovaries of women, it's been found in the heart and what have you, and hence the reason why something called myocarditis and pericarditis, particularly in young men, has been more prominent. Another thing that isn't often spoken about, even though we said that the individuals in the trial were not as numerous as you'd expect, particularly in the elderly group, it is known that the constituent of the vaccine that was done in the trial was different to the batches that were then rolled out. And it is known that there is a lot of a residual DNA from a particular bacteria that was used to increase the volume of the production of the vaccine, which is fine and has been done in the past. You basically use sort of like an intermediary thing to proliferate what you're looking to create. But then it is key that you sort of flush that away, you get rid of it, so that when the actual thing, the vaccine you inject, hasn't got that facilitator in it at the time. It has been found that in differing parts of different batches of the vaccine, there's a massive amount of residual DNA from the bacteria that was utilized to facilitate the creation of the mRNA that shouldn't be there. And it is a lot of evidence to show that has caused some quite serious problems. One final thing I'll say in this little piece, you might have heard of the yellow card system. The yellow card system was a little bit like the VAERS, VAERS system, which was basically like a system that you could and your doctor could notify the Medical Health Regulatory Authority, the MHRA, of a severe adverse reaction to the vaccination. But the numbers that were utilized, the numbers that were registered on the yellow card system was very, very small. But more significantly, so they think that only about 1 to 2% of the actual serious adverse effects were actually registered on the yellow card system. But more importantly, when this Dr. Watson communicated or attempted to communicate with the MHRA in relation to the yellow cards he'd submitted, the MHRA ignored his communications, and he believes the result was they just didn't look at them. So even though there was only about 2% of the serious adverse effects that were put on the yellow card system, even those weren't taken seriously, which is of immense concern. And one final thing to say, sorry, I did say final, but this is, I think, the final for the now. A vaccine, one of the main things that allows a medication to be called a vaccine is that it prevents infection. That's why you have, the childhood vaccine. It prevents you getting infected. And if it prevents you getting infected, it prevents you transmitting it. And if it prevents you transmitting it and getting infected, it prevents the probability of you being hospitalized because you have the virus, because you haven't been infected. And therefore, if it stops you being infected, stops you transmitting it, stops you getting into hospital, it stops you dying of it because you can't have it in the first place. Sadly, although, and this is the reason they had to change the definition of a vaccine, the medication, the drug that they used to inject us for COVID, even in the Pfizer trials, even though we said they didn't last very long, they knew that it didn't stop infection. They knew that it didn't stop transmission. Therefore, they knew that it couldn't stop you getting hospitalized, and therefore they knew it wouldn't reduce the possibility of you dying. So it raises a few questions, doesn't it? Anyway, thank you for listening to this bit. We'll have a part 2 coming up. Thank you. Speak to you soon. Bye-bye.